All right, so thank you so much for having me here today. I worked with Angela on some art projects, and some of which you'll see in this presentation today. So I want to sorry about that. Ugh, apologies. I'm gonna I am in there we go. Okay, so here we go. So I have good news for you all, and I have some bad news for you all. And I'm going to start with the good news because why not, right? So the good news is that there's a new day coming. There's a new dawn coming. And when this time comes, there will be a feeling, and the feeling will feel very much like springtime. And springtime is the freshness, the optimism, the hope that comes after the darkness of winter. Would it be best if I, just FYI, would it be best if I take this off, the images of people and all? Would that help? Or is it best if I keep this up?
Oh no, like everyone has an individual view, so they can see the participants if they want, or whatever, wherever they choose.
All right, so I'm gonna just get that out of the way. So anyway, so there's a feeling that is likely to come. And this feeling is very much like the feeling of springtime. It's like the feeling of fresh energy and babies and nesting and new possibility. And when this comes, there you go. When this happens, the feeling will be very much like the 1950s in this era of, if you just, most of us weren't alive then, but this gleaming future, technology is going to make everything wonderful, life is grand, there's there's a little bit of a simplicity and an innocence in this worldview, but this is what's likely to be coming around the corner. The bad news is that in order to get to spring, you first have to go through winter. And with winter, what is winter, right? Winter is, it's a dark time. It's a difficult time. It's cold, it's bitter. We are in what is likely to be a crisis era that started around 2008 and is going to about 2030, plus or minus a couple of years, but not too much less. In wintertime, we all know what happens in winter, right? The old and the sick animals die, and trees lose their leaves and pull in, and there isn't as much food available. From a perspective of society, people tend to pull closer to their tribe, to their people, to stay in and connect more with their own. And basically, as you can kind of hear me kind of indicating and hinting, that there are different moods, and there's different cultural moods, national moods, eras, and times. And generations are born in certain times. They're born during certain world views. They're born when the outer world and adults have a worldview that impacts how children are raised. And this phenomena of seasons and seasons are cyclical, right? I mean, you don't just have spring, summer, fall, and winter. You have spring, summer, fall, and winter, and then it goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. And this understanding of time as a 4-part cycle is pretty understandable in our experience as human beings. We understand, the clock and the 4 quadrants on the clock, morning, afternoon, sunset, evening, and then into the night, 4 chunks of time. We understand, in nature that there's these seasons, and even in when people talk about like product life cycles, the introduction, the growth, the maturity, and the decline. This concept of a 4-part cycle is quite understood, even if you haven't given it much thought intellectually. You know it and you observe it. It's all around you. And when these national moods and these attitudes change, they impact everything. I mean, we see it in fashion, we see it in the movies, music and all this stuff, but it's also happening at every single level of like how, what's the attitude toward business? Are people more entrepreneurial, or do they have a higher desire for the golden handshake and a job for their life? Are they more risk averse, or are they more embracing of risk and failure? Is there more of an orientation toward individualism and civic duty, or less so? And these things change, and not only do they change, but they change on a cyclical, understandable level. So, but we're going to be talking about now today. I don't really need to rehash 2020. We all lived it. It was pretty darn intense. lots and lots of people were super excited, and there were a lot of jokes and memes about saying, goodbye to 2020, blah, blah, blah. And then January 6th happened, right? So, it's like, so the main thing is, we are in the era known as winter. And while all seasons and all cultural moods have different impact and effect, winter is intense, right? The feelings that people have, there's always political arguments, there's always disagreements in how the country should be run, but the level of intensity at this point in time, while it may be a little harder for younger people to understand because they don't have as many years or decades under them, if you've lived 35, 45, 55 years or so, you have more of a sense of now is very different than before. And I do want to offer that I'm going to be talking about some fairly theoretical things and things that have to do with cycles and culture change and all that some people just don't groove on, and that's okay. If you're not into this that much, just tune into the part about your generation. And if nothing else, you will gain more understanding about yourself and your peers and just the larger world. So I am going to posit that there are 4 generational personas. There are 4 generational archetypes, there are 4 generational personalities, and these characters, these personas, are one of the primary, if not the primary element to how culture changes in a nation. We all know, because we experience it, we live it, we are it. There's 4 primary phases of life. Obviously, there are sub phases, within childhood, and being an infant is different than being a toddler, which is different than being a kid, which is different than being a teenager, but there is a general phase of life called childhood, 0 to 21. Young adulthood is pretty much like kind of 22 to early 40s. Midlife is kind of like mid 40s to mid 60s, and elderhood is like mid 60s and on. And then there's a time period, which is called coming of age. By the way, these are some of the images that Angela created for me. Thank you so much, Angela. So anyway, we have these 4 phases of life. And when you take the 4 personalities, the four generational personas and the 4 phases of life, there's this thing that happens, which is they move together to create these 4 cultural moods, cultural eras, and experiences that other generations then grow up in. So springtime is, as we mentioned earlier, it's what comes after winter. It's a very innocent time. It's a time of technology and optimism and hope. There's a lot of simplicity in life. It's a time when children are indulged, because after a really dark, difficult time with economic difficulties and death and all kinds of things, that whatever happens in winter, society is ready to turn its attention away from fear about the outer world to care for and indulging children and building a brighter future. The enemy is gone, the danger is past, it's time now to rebuild upon the ashes. This is the era of boomers' childhood. And then about 20 years pass, and then we get to this next era, this next time. This is often referred to as summer or the awakening era. It's a time of spiritual upheaval. It's a time of sexual revolution. It's a time when people have tired of the simplicity and the mainstream efficiency of the previous era and are now ready for individuality, for their own personal creativity, for authenticity. This is the time of Gen Xers childhood. And it's a time when adults are actually very, very focused on their own needs. And it's, I'm not gonna say it's a difficult time to be a child, because every generation gets what it gets, but it is a time when the needs of children are at the bottom of society's priority list. And then after we have this era with these neglected children, we start to have this, society kind of goes, whoa, like that's not so cool, that we just sort of left these kids, kicked them to the curb. And what there starts to be is this vast focus on children and on protecting children. This is Millennials' childhood. And this is when there's a lot of personal optimism about personal finances, personal feeling of being okay, but the general attitude towards civics, toward government, toward institutions is darkening. It's darkening and getting, people just don't have belief that change can be made through politics and government. And these are broad stroke statements, obviously, right? I mean, there's millions and millions of people in the country, and everyone has different opinions, everyone's their own person, but these are sort of the general mood of the country. And then after about 20, 22 years or so, we move on into the winter era. And for us in the United States, the winter, the crisis era started in 2008 with the great financial crisis. And it will go to approximately 2030. Again, maybe a couple years before, it won't be many years after probably, but it's, 2030 is a good number. And just so you have a frame of reference for this, the past American winters that we have had have been the American Revolutionary War era, Civil War. You can see it on the screen, Great Depression through World War II, and then now. And as we all know, because whether you've given this much thought or you just know it because you know it, right? If you're born around the same time, you have what's called shared age location, right? So then you experience the outer world and you're getting programmed, right? Children don't have the capacity to discern. They're receiving the programming from adults. They're receiving culture. They're receiving how the world is as told to them by adults, as they're getting messages from media and about government and how the educational system is run and all these kinds of things. Children are absorbing all this information. And when they have a similar location in time, it creates a similar worldview, which this is how you get a similar generational persona. Again, this is all stuff whether you've given it a whole lot of conscious thought or not, whatever, but I'm just sort of repeating what you probably already know. What you probably don't know is that this thing with the seasons, that there is a specificity to it. And if you don't have to, this is not stuff that you have to memorize per se, but just so you can understand the phenomena of the mechanism of how culture changes. So boomers have their childhood in spring, in this time of optimism and hope. They have their young adulthood in this consciousness raising and spiritual revolution and all this kind of stuff. They have their midlife in what's often called the harvest season or fall, when there's just lots of wealth to pull out of the system. And they have their elderhood in winter or the crisis era. You can just look at the numbers down on the bottom. You can see how Xers, it all just moves up one, right? Xers have their childhood in summer, blah, 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 blah. You don't have to read it all. You can kind of follow along. Millennials, everything moves along. And then today's children have their childhood in winter. And generations are defined by the cultural mood of their childhood. So, this generation that is in winter during its childhood is always the generation that's in winter during its childhood. It is marked by, it is formed by, and its life path is created by this experience of having a childhood during the dark times of society. So again, these are pictures that Angela drew for me. Thank you so much. So looking at these four personalities, these four generational characters, where are they now? We can start with millennials. And these years may not align with exactly what you've heard. They may or may not. These are the years that I work with that have a lot to do with a bigger theory about how generations are formed. So this is what I'm going with. Feel free to, align or not align. But you can kind of see when you look at this that the early wave, the early ones, like when they're first arriving, their parents are boomers. The first kind of 7 years, it's mostly boomers. Even up to the halfway point, the parents are mostly boomers. But around the midpoint of millennials, Xers started also being the parents of millennials. And then then as it moved on, boomers are getting older, and it's more Xers who are having the millennial children. And then even toward the end, like Xers it's almost exclusively Xers who gave birth to children born in these years. You can see over here on the right that society calls these folks Gen Z, and that's okay. But if you really want to understand generations, you'll understand that Gen Z are actually late wave millennials. That'll give you the best insight. Millennials are mostly the generation in young adulthood, although they're still coming of age. This is sort of the coming of age and their midlife, their young adulthood years. And where millennials are now is they are in young adulthood, right? So they're 17 to 39 in 2021. And when a generation, doesn't matter whether it's millennials, Xers, boomers, doesn't matter. Whatever generation is in young adulthood, they are the vitality of the nation. And this is what they do, right? They leave their parents' nest or not, whatever, but they're starting to build careers, families, they're serving in the military. They're the muscle and the might of the nation. They impact the mood of the nation. and they're testing their values, which is an important aspect, which so you acquire your values in childhood and you test your values in midlife. These are just, this is human development 101. This is basic societal functioning 101. I mean, everyone knows this. It's helpful to see it from the perspective of understanding how culture changes. So millennials now are, again, they're in young adulthood. They're very outer world focused. They're shadow generation, their parent generation. The boomers are very inner world focused. So there's this kind of alternating pattern that happens with generations. They're incredibly heroic. They're individually and collectively, they feel like they're a hero generation. They're achievement oriented, very, very mainstream, selfless. I put together a list of adjectives and words to describe them. So you can sort of see a theme here, right? You know, they're wholesome, they're confident, they're optimistic, you know, they're very level-headed and public service oriented. And when you think of millennials in young adulthood during the time of winter, a very good image to think of them is good cheer soldiers. So, you know, while the picture of the Iwo Jima, you know, pictures here, but it's also like this picture of these, they're all in uniform, they're picking up trash, they have a good attitude about it. You know, there's a good cheer nature to millennials that is just a profound aspect of who they are. And what this generation seeks, and, you know, I mean, this is, again, these are broad stroke statements, right? But one of the primary things that millennials want is a happy, conventional, well-rounded life, which to millennials may seem like, well, of course, everyone would want that, but different generations actually want different things. But this is very important to millennials, that they have a happy, conventional, well-rounded life. And the millennial desire for a middle-class existence for all of their generation is huge. So Gen Xers don't have this desire. Gen Xers are the risk-taking, gambling, you know, either you're gonna, you know, make it with the stock options with your company, or you're gonna end up living in your parents' basement. It's okay, one way or the other, you're gonna do your best and try, right? Millennials also want order and harmony, and really when they look up the age ladder at Xers and boomers, just feel like society has gotten grimy and dysfunctional, and like they can do a much better job, you know, restoring order and harmony. They're also stepped progress and again, with that means they like to take a step, achieve, take a step, achieve, take a step, achieve. Again, this is very different than Xers, who are very risk oriented and willing to try and fail at much higher levels, and boomers who are just kind of in their own world doing their own thing, very creative, very inner focused world that they live. And they're heroes, and they definitely want to be at the table when decisions are being made and have impact and influence on leaders. Every generation is impacted by the season that is the cultural mood that is happening. So, you know, obviously, if you're in young adulthood and you're setting out into the world and you're picking a career, or where do you want to live, and all these kinds of things, and then you're in the middle of this like crisis era, it's a bit tough. You know, it's a bit challenging, especially if you're an achievement-oriented generation. So this is really challenging for the millennials. One of the things that millennials need to know is that en masse, they may be required, not required, but they may be called into national service. And that may be in the form of war, it may be something else, but it is common, and it often happens during winter, that there is a need for the millennials to rise up en masse in good cheer and to serve the nation in a very specific way. How millennials impact this season is that they make the dark times brighter. And, you know, Gen Xers are very cynical, especially they were when they're younger, and boomers tend to be rather pessimistic. In both generations, Xers and boomers tend to be very individualistic. And so millennials, with their less risk-taking, you know, more team-oriented, bright-eyed, confident, good cheer attitude, actually really help society in a dark time not be so dark, if that makes any sense. And there's a you know, there's a sense of like they're good kids, that they shouldn't be burdened with, even though you maybe take offense at the word kids, but I mean, you know, older adults looking down, like it's like they shouldn't be burdened with all these problems that have been allowed to pile up. And then for millennials, some of your strategies for right now are your relationships with boomers can be very, very good when you have a guru-like relationship with them, when they're teaching you like from their inner wisdom, from their inner experience. They're very good at soft skills and business skills and how to dress properly and, present and all these kinds of things. Boomers don't tend to be as good at, and boomers, by the way, are born, I'll get to this in a second, but the years I use are 1943 to 1960. Boomers don't tend to be as good at direction that's specific, that produces results. They tend to be better at high level, lofty direction and stuff like that. Your Xers, if you're a millennial, Xers are where you get your direction and your learning and your understanding about how to be efficient, results, how to get things done with very few resources. And Xers and millennials have a profoundly good energy together for moving things along, for getting things done very efficiently and very well. The other thing with the millennials is if you have any friends that are falling out and aren't in alignment with your generation's core personality, reach out to them, because your generation does well when all of you do well. It's just part of your core. Xers are very like, yeah, I like these people, but it's not my responsibility where they end up, but your generation has a very different vibe. So I would say really turn to anyone that you see kind of falling down or tripping a bit. And also to millennials, trust that your future is brighter, because it is. Okay, to my Gen Xers in the house. Do I have any Xers here? Yay. Hello, Xers. So I'm an Xer too. I'm an early wave for Xers. So locate yourself here. And if you're not an Xer, you may have like colleagues or, uncle or someone who's this generation. So just sort of see where they are. Sometimes people in this age range were called like Gen Y. A long time ago, there was a term called Gen Y that was kind of popular. So it was kind of just like their Gen Zs were in this range over here, Gen Y tend to be around there. And Xers are just like, every generation is going to be in childhood, come of age, young adulthood. Xers are in midlife. And yes, that is a little bit of blood. He's kind of beaten up. Xers are 40 to 60 years old this year, and they're the generation that is primarily in midlife. And so when a generation is in midlife, it is the generation that has the predominant power and say and control over day-to-day functions of business, of resources, that's just think about it. I mean, if you're 45 to 65 years old, you're more likely to be a school principal than, someone who's 35. They're more likely to be a teacher, maybe a department head, but not necessarily the principal, right? So we understand this phenomena. We witness it all around us, but it's important to know that at this time, during this season of winter, during this crisis era, the generation that has primary control over how things are happening, not as much in government, the national government, because Xers don't express as much in their power in government as other generations do. But also the important thing to know about Gen Xers is that they have the primary influence on children. So the children of today, the children born between 2005 and about 2027, will be mostly influenced by Xers. Midlife Xers are frenetic, exhausted, pragmatic, resolute, very protective of children. And here's just some more words. You can just sort of see how different they are, right, than the millennials, right? They're fierce, they're colorful, they're disaffected, they're cunning, resolute. And when you think of midlife Xers in winter, what you want to think of, a good image for them is that they're the generals. And they're not just the generals, they're the generals during really tough times that are leading the troops with, minimal resources and maybe only partial facts and, having to make decisions, on the fly and, figure things out. But today, like I said, where Xers present and show up with the primary level of influence, I mean, it's all over because they're midlife leaders, but they're the tech titans of today. I mean, Amazon, Twitter, Zoom, Google, eBay, Slack, Salesforce. I mean, these are all companies, Airbnb, that are all, founded by, Xers. And what midlife Xers are wanting, and again, these are broad stroke statements that, could have listed other things here, but Xers are very into this thing called having a life. It's a big point for them. And part of that includes having work-life balance. Xers Xers spent much of their young adulthood years being as far away from the center of society as they could, being as X, as far away from that which is the centrifugal part of life. And so in midlife, that reverses for them, and they start to move toward a sense of community, to restore community, and to simplify life, and be less, preferably if possible, less hectic. They're also super ultra focused on the safety of children, and they're very outcomes focused, whereas boomers, the generation above them, are very morals and values focused. So Xers are impacted by winter by, I mean, come on, I mean, like, you know, your prime earning years are in your midlife years, right? Your mid 40s to your mid 60s kind of. And so they hit their prime earning years at the worst possible time to have those years. And they have the worst possible chance of recovery afterward, because they're going to go into old age after this. Whereas millennials, while they're being impacted by this, they have more in their life cycle. They still have their midlife and their elderhood to recover. Millennials actually end up doing very well financially for the most part. Or they will, this generational archetype does. So anyway, they're just incredibly busy and exhausted because they're the midlife leaders. Their jobs are bigger. They've got probably, you know, many of them have kids. They might be taking care of parents, and their role in society is very different. Well, they're not just the midlife leaders, they're the midlife leaders during a crisis, right? So it's just a little tough, but that's their thing. When the winter closes and when springtime comes again, Xers get a profound amount of the blame and very little credit for the actual work that they did. And they don't really even fuss about it, because Xers are just like, yeah, whatever. Like we don't expect you to exalt us. The way that Xers impact winter is they have a lot of grit and resolve. They're very good at at taking action, at doing what needs to be done, at just making sure that the problems of the day and the multiple fires and all that are going all over are taken care of. They're very focused on the nuts and bolts. A lot of the dirty work, a lot of the difficult decisions that have to be made during a crisis. A crisis era is when the nation's survival feels in peril. And so the previous ways that decisions might be made, or what was considered appropriate or whatever, of how something might have been decided upon, that's just kind of, a lot of that just gets pushed to the side. I mean, even just think of how the nation had to respond with COVID and no N95 masks. I mean, businesses all over the place started like, well, we'll make ventilators, we'll do this, we'll do whatever, right? It wasn't government as much as it was, I mean, there was a governmental function, but Xers and many of the midlife Xers were just taking care of business. Xer strategies for now include very much so to strengthen tribe and network. Xers understand, for the most part, that government benefits that are offered to other generations and are told are going to be available for Xers aren't really going to be there. So to the extent that, as an Xer, if you can root into your community, deepen your network, really find your tribe. These are very important things for Xers. Make the tough decisions you need to make. When working with youth, you always want to work with youth to give them what they need, not how you would have wanted to be treated in your young adulthood years. And then part of what Xers' responsibility actually is to chill boomers out a bit, because boomers are very values oriented and inner moral oriented, and you don't compromise on your values. And so boomers can sometimes, in a time where things are really tense and everything's very intense, boomers can make decisions sometimes that have big consequences in a crisis era. And Xers, it's just part of the Xer role is to just kind of chill them out a bit. They don't always do so effectively, but that's part of their role. So on to our boomers. We got any boomers in the house? Anyone? Okay, so these are where your boomers are at. Youngest 61, oldest 78. And they're in elderhood now. When your generation is in elderhood, when any generation's in elderhood, it is society's leadership generation. It's the stewards of the nation. It's the elders, the statesmen, the CEOs, the board chairs, just Google like Senate leadership, and the committee chairs. I mean, they're and you look at the ages and you just have to look at their faces, right? You can tell they're mostly older. A generation in elderhood is retired and retiring. It's thinking about its legacy, and it's also transferring values to other generations. So again, this is human development, societal stuff 101. And it does impact how culture changes. So elder boomers, they're austere, they're very wise, they're respected. They're stern. They're very much like the patriarchs and the matriarchs of society. They're a bit on the pious and noble side. And one of the things that boomers don't know because they haven't lived it yet, but they're starting to, is that the boomer generation will not go down in history as the flower children of the 60s and the 70s, but they'll go down as the legendary great champions. And, they may or may not be called that, name per se, but just sort of think of like Gandalf the Grey, and there's, he's not fancy looking, he's kind of craggy looking, but there's a pious nobility and a sternness to him. And what boomers' role is on a big global level is during the crisis, they're not the generals, right? They're not the ones in the fields. They're not the ones making the primary decisions about day-to-day activities and institutions and all, but they're the ones that are pointing the way morally out. They're like the compass that points society out of the darkness. That's kind of their role. Elder boomers want to be, I know you may not believe this, but they want to be authentically old people. And what I mean by that is that boomers have this kind of funny propensity to initially deny and resist whatever age they're in, and then they embrace it. And when they embrace it, they want all of society to focus on it. So rather than like when millennials are old and the elders, millennials will be chipper, upbeat, healthy, vibrant, active senior citizens who are all like bright-eyed and, good civic members of society. Boomers in elderhood are the keepers, the wisdom keepers. They're the elders of the tribe. They're, again, kind of like Gandalf the Grey, it's a different vibe. And they, while some of them can afford to retire and some not, what they don't want is they don't want to retire from life. They want to very much solidify their values and have their say about the direction of society. They're not interested in going out to pasture at all. How they're impacted by winter, the latter half of them are particularly impacted financially. I mean, again, this is, vast numbers of people and lots of individuals within these statements that I'm making, but the latter half doesn't fare as well as the first half, and financially. And so they need to lower their consumption, and seriously, for many of them. This also goes back to I'll get to this with the strategies, for them creating intentional communities as well. This is their final crusade. This is their thing. And boomers see themselves, and the rest of society mostly sees them too, as the most morally focused generation. And so they also are going to start to have more battles among their generation about who gets what benefits, because in order for them all to get equal benefits, they're basically going to bankrupt millennials and Gen Xers on the way. Boomers' impact on winter is that very much that priest warrior kind of personality. They are legendary. They demand alignment with certain values. I mean, they can't make anyone as an individual do it, but that they're very boomers are more of a social engineering generation. They want to use their influence to impact how people function and how society and families and all function. And the generation before them was very much the Botox generation, very much the not wanting to get old generation. And boomers are actually, you're going to see more and more embracing of old age by this generation. And rather than wanting $1 million worth of medical care in the last 72 hours of their life, they're going to embrace and decline more medical care and want more of a natural death and a natural aging process. You'll start to see it more and more as this generation continues to age. And the other thing too is, as I mentioned earlier with millennials, you may be called into some sort of sacrificial activity en masse for your generation. And the generation that calls you to do this is the boomers. So it may or may not happen. I don't know, can't speak to a future that hasn't happened, but if it happens, that will be that. And then boomer strategies for now are form your intentional families and your intentional communities. You're gonna need more resources that are not necessarily going to be available from the government. And part of the issue here is boomers grew up, their childhood was during the golden age. And so they have this, the worldview that got programmed into their minds when they're in that pre-memory kind of state. when you're in that kind of 0 to 6 years old, and just what comes in about the world, it's pre-memory, right? If you can't resist it, it's just coming in and your brain's just sort of taking it in. But they have this understanding that the world is expansive. And so they've been spending and living as though the world is expansive. And what happens is when they hit old age, a lot of them are kind of like, oh, this isn't quite what I was thinking. So the need to spend less is important. They're going to, like I said, really embrace old age. Boomers are very good at mentoring millennials when it comes to soft skills and talking to them in a kind of a, like I said, a guru sort of fashion. It's important for boomers to recognize that Xers are the generation in midlife and to not thwart them. Xers are very good at fast decisions that have to do with quick analysis of resources and what needs to get done and the result that needs to happen. And it's important that there not be a lot of getting in the way of that. And their role right now is to steward the nation, to help the nation remember its values and to focus on what's important in the big picture. And they are, as I said earlier, legendary. Okay, today's kids. So today's kids are 16 and under. This is a totally new generation. I am quite certain that 99% of what you've heard about the generation after millennials is Gen Z, but I'm here to let you know that if you follow that, you'll get some amount of information, but the real information is that the generation that comes after millennials are the children born in 2005 and afterward. This generation, here they are in their childhood. They have, obviously they have yet to go on, but this generation is also Joe Biden's generation. It's Martin Luther King's generation. It's most of the Beatles, Bernie Sanders, so when I talked earlier about there being 4 generational personas and 4 generational types, they repeat, and they repeat in a specific cycle. So they're here right now, but we also have some of the elders that are still alive, including our president. So anyway, this generation is kids. When you're children, your focus in life is to grow and develop. Society wants that for you. You play, you learn, you develop your social skills, you're protected and cared for. You're acquiring your values and you're forming your generational worldview at this point in time in your life. These kids are overprotected. That's because their parents are mostly Xers. Xers were underprotected. A generation that's underprotected raises children in an overprotected manner. A group of children that are overprotected in childhood will raise their children in an underprotected manner. And there's a whole pendular, cyclical nature to how all this works. They're sensitive, polite, obedient, a little bit worried and thankful for all the protections they receive. They're diligent, they're innocent, a bit on the emotionally fragile side. They grow up to be incredibly kind and decent people as a general rule. What they want, one of the things they really want is they want to be like the millennials, and they want to be like the heroes. And this is one of the things that plagues them for the entirety of their life, which is that they'll never be the heroes because they weren't the right age to be the heroes at the right time. And they're helpers, they want to contribute, and obviously they're kids, right? So they just want to be kids. When you think of this generation, I like this picture from, this is a Norman Rockwell painting that done in the early 1940s. And on one hand, the kids look all innocent and everything's like all sweet and this net, but if you look at a close-up of the father, of the newspaper that the father's holding, it's, bombings, horrors, Hitler, et cetera. So this is the experience of this generation is a hyper-protected, suffocated childhood, while the adults are focused on an outer world danger and crisis where the nation feels at peril. The survival of the nation feels in peril. And that's it, my friends, that's it. Let's open to questions. And, if any of you want to, connect with me, just join on Clubhouse, but I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, et cetera.
And real fast, if you haven't filled out the poll question, if you click on poll, you'll be able to get to it and answer away.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to keep my screen open just in case I need to go to any past slides, but does anyone have any questions or anything?
I have a question for you. Before I met you, I didn't really know about generational theory. How did you kind of get into this type of research?
So the semi-short story is that my sister, who's a math teacher, and I were talking back in the late 90s, and we had this whole vision of how to teach kids about math by teaching them how to buy their clothes, so that, you buy every item you buy has to go with 3 items. And she was like, we were going to teach them about math and budgeting. And we basically came up with the early Poshmark, or I think that's the right site, where people could be selling their items. This was back in the 90s. And we were aiming at middle schoolers. And so, my brain was like, well, there's a book for everything, right? So I went looking for a book on how to market to millennials. And I found this book called Millennials Rising. And the amazing thing is that the people who found the theory, because founded is it's more like they observed it, right? They didn't create it, they observed it. But they actually named the millennials when the oldest millennial was in 3rd grade. And they wrote a book describing this generation when the oldest of them were just like in like high school. And it's so, for me, what's been fascinating, what I so love about generations is not only do I have this academic knowledge and this experience of working with businesses and all, but I have been studying it for 20 years. And so I've watched things change. So it's like when you know the theory and when you know when you know that, this generation, the world was different when millennials were first coming into the workforce. Well, now millennials are, 12, however many years into the workforce. So the feeling of the mood of the country shifts, all the time. And when you have the overall understanding of the model and just the basics, it's fascinating because I can see things like at the grocery store of like products that are for sale and this and that. And also the work that I base this presentation on and all is the work of William Strauss and Neil Howe. And they've just written gobs of books on the subject. They're historians and political professors and all that kind of stuff. I see a question. Does that answer your question, Angela? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Gary?
Hey, so real quick, can you describe the term the greatest generation? And do you think that generation will change at some point or will it remain the same?
So the greatest generation was born 1901 to 1924. They're sometimes called the GI generation. And archetypally, remember when I said there's 4 personalities, there's 4 personas? Millennials are the same generation as the greatest generation, which is why they have a lot of alignment with them. But they were a hero generation, and they went on to be, the heroes of World War II, and went on to have many government benefits afterward and to retire early. And, so the greatest generation was, they were the kids when they were children, things like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts were founded. And, the whole thing of like putting kids in uniforms and bringing them into safe spaces and all. And it came after the previous generation, right? Because millennials come after Gen Xers. So the greatest generation came after the lost generation, which was the last version of the Gen Xer like generation. And that was when you think of those pictures of like child labor laws and little kids out, in the freezing cold selling newspapers, the newsies, that in child labor, just being a thing that was just accepted that, yeah, kids worked and this and all this kind of stuff, like that was on the backs of Gen Xers, the Gen Xer like generation. And then all that tightening around protecting children happened for the greatest generation, which is the same experience that the millennials had. Does that answer your question? I see another one. Can't see your name, but I see a pinkish shirt. Corey, can I help you? Do you have a question, Corey?
Yeah, can you hear me? Good, yeah. So thank you, Jessie, for that presentation. I did learn a lot. I had a question. You went through those 4 kind of generational archetypes and how they're in a cycle, and you kind of grounded that cycle in these like American historical events. And I was wondering if in your research you've seen those same sort of generational cycles occur in cultures outside of the United States, internationally. And I was also thinking about this new younger generation, because we're like a more global interconnected society. If this upcoming generation will be more of like a global generation than any in the past. Just wanted to know if you had any thoughts on that.
Sure. So, so the phenomena of this generational cycle, this phenomena happens in humanity, where you have a society that has heavier glass, bigger glass ceilings. Maybe you live in an environment where you were there was a feudal lord and you were a serf, or, in a place where there's barons and baronesses and you're not just never going to get it to the upper echelons, whatever. Or you live in a society where youth are not allowed much choice. Like, for example, if you lived in a culture where it's like your parents are like, this is who you're going to marry, or daddy was a cobbler, your daddy's daddy was a cobbler, you're going to be a cobbler too, right? So when you have societies that youth don't have much choice and where there's not upward mobility, the phenomena of generations only cycles up when there's two types of crises. So this is all bigger theory stuff, but basically there's either a secular crisis that everything's falling apart in the society, the bridges are falling down, whatever, or there's a spiritual crisis. And what happens is the cycle will start, there'll be a generational cycle, and then it'll kind of die down. So that's one thing, right? But what's happening is more and more and more of the world is becoming on sync, where there are fewer kings and monarchs that are really, controlling things. More people have upward mobility, and more youth have access to more things having to do with their own taste making and their own choice, right? So the phenomena of generations is starting to spread more. You asked about the references that I used that were very US centric. I tell you, I just today, I started working with this group in Ireland, and it's like, I'm trying to find out what the years are. And it's like, there's, it's like Europe is about 5 years behind, but other countries aren't synced. And also it's a little messy in terms of like a lot of times people will say things like, blah, 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 I'll read these papers. It'll be like, we interviewed, 60,000 millennials from across the world. And I'm like, well, did you? Because are millennials the same years from country to country, right? Are they? Or are you just saying that because someone said these are the years of birth, you went out and did a survey? So it is an inexact science, an inexact social science. Then to your question about the homelanders, the generation of children, are they going to be more global? They actually start off being very homogenous, less global, and more like in these little smaller bubbles because their parents are protecting them more. And what happens is when this generation starts to come of age and starts to come into young adulthood, they're pluralistic, which means like this is the generation, the homeland generation is known as the artist archetype. So millennials are known as the hero archetype. This is known as the artist archetype because what they do is they're very nuanced and gentle and sensitive, but they're also very artistic and expressive. They make the greatest poets, the greatest playwrights, the greatest singers and songwriters. So many of the songs that boomers call theirs from their Woodstocky kind of, consciousness raising days and all are actually songs sung by the prior generation, written and sung by the prior generation. So this generation actually starts off very homogenistic, but it expands and starts to cross-pollinate other cultures and things like that. So they become global, but they start off very not global.
Real fast before we take the next question, I'm going to be closing the poll out in about a minute. So if anyone hasn't taken the poll question, do so now.
I see someone, a guy with a dark shirt, has got his hand up. Can't see your name.
George.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Actually, the very recent discussion answered some of my questions in that the timing of what generation you want belong to or identify with will vary regionally.
Country, yeah.
I think that's probably also true of the season that you grew up in. Because I would say growing up in Scotland in the early 60s, it was grim. It was more like growing up in the Depression. I mean, there was rationing, there were lines to get things. It wasn't a boom time until much later.
So this is the early 60s. So yeah, so what I've heard, what I've read, and it, like I said, I'm really challenged right now because I just started working with this group in Ireland and I'm like, I'm not sure what their years are. But what I've read is that much of so a lot of the generations has to do with, exactly to your point, is when does spring start, right? So not all of Europe recovered, right? The United States was relatively unscathed from World War II. So its recovery was fairly quick because it had built up all this capacity for wartime capacity, but its literal impact, I mean, people died. I don't mean to say that there wasn't impact, but I mean, but the actual physical country didn't take much of a hit. And so they could transform all this power that had been directed to the war toward industry, toward this bright gleaming future. But much of Europe took a very different hit and had a much more grim, to your point, recovery period. And so their cycle's a little different. What I'm trying to figure out, and I don't really know yet, is if generations still are typically about 20 years in length, but because of the speed of the technology with millennials and all in particular having benefited from so much more global technology, that I think that the millennial generation is a little more synced up. So the 10 to 15 years behind or whatever, I don't think it has stayed as consistent over the decades. I'm not an expert on it. I wish there was a resource where I could point and be like, here you go. But I don't have that. But thanks for that story, George.
Because I'm thinking in some ways I identify more with Generation X based upon the way you characterize the different generation with broad strokes than with late boomer.
What's your birth year, George?
1954, but like I said, I grew up in winter.
Yeah. So a lot of it part of it has to do with when you also hit economic cycles. So like if you were a child during your country's winter, you're not in your earning years during your childhood years, right? So that's why actually the homeland generation actually ends up being the richest generation, because they don't take an economic hit because you're not earning income during your country's winter. So when your childhood is in winter, all of your earning years are in years where the economy is performing better. So you might actually be more of an artist generation, which is more like the kind, sensitive. Are you a good arbitrator? Kind, decent. Like very sensitive to the needs of others. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you are. Maybe.
Not according to people I know.
The artist generation tends to be very technocratic, very administrivia, believing that due process and law is the way to change things. Your birth years, but then you moved over to the US at some point, so you sort of like would align with your peers and all over here. So, or assuming you're in the US.
Yeah. So yeah, my late teens, my teens and 20s and after were in the US. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're more boomer like, but I mean, I don't know.
I'll take one cultural divide, punk rock. A lot of boomers think that was the end of the world for the great 60s culture, and I saw it as part of the same wild hippie music. or even hip hop. I got into hip hop, which is kind of weird. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much about me.
I have a question. So we at thank you again. This was an amazing presentation and very eye-opening and really interesting, and not a way that I've ever heard this presented, despite the fact of being in marketing and very focused on different targets. So we are embarking on a strategic planning process at the Science Center. And one of the things we're considering and trying to understand is kind of like the bigger macro trends that could be affecting us, 5 to 7 years from now. How would you categorize like this from a generational standpoint as something that we should be considering as we're thinking about kind of generations in the workplace?
It's a great question. Thanks, Tracy. And thank you for just supporting, being part of an organization that supports this wonderful organization. So the next 5 to 7 years are winter. And it's hard to make plans because it is a time when systems are crashing and crumbling. What happens in spring is that society either emerges gloriously, so for example, the United States emerged gloriously from World War II, fairly unscathed. It came in as a reasonable power. It emerged as a superpower with like the United Nations on its soil, NATO, all that, like the World Bank. I mean, there's all this stuff that like happened, and the US was like front and center, right? So it emerged gloriously. After the Civil War, the country didn't emerge so gloriously. It emerged out of the ashes, right? So what we don't know at this point is we don't know whether we're going to emerge from ashes or from glory. We don't know, right? So part of this thing is what I really feel, and I would, for any of you, if you have opportunities to, first of all, this is the first time I did this presentation, in this particular way. I'd love feedback, whether I spoke too much or or whether this was helpful or you wish I'd done more here or there. I'm totally, if you want to, send me that or, give me that kind of feedback, really open to it. But I genuinely believe in this work, this body of work, because if there's ever a time in society's history where it needs to focus on generations, it's now. Because we're in the crisis era and all generations need to be supported in their role now, right? So millennials need to learn how to be, they're very good at being team-oriented, but sometimes they're a little fast to chomp at the bit and want to be at the lead, but they need more leadership training or support for them to be that. Now, before I go too far off on your question, you're saying like strategically for the Science Center, like what do you need to do for?
Yeah, like just how should we think about this from a macro trend? And I think the way you started the question was really good because you've kind of helped me to frame, in the sense of we're in winter right now. So for this planning horizon, we're in winter. So you kind of gave a framework for that, but I don't know if, if there was just any other additional thoughts about that.
So one of the things is to stay really nimble, right? You want to be careful because things can change on a dime in winter. And local is very important. You want to, anything that you can do as an organization to help people root to their community, right? Root to their local energy, local focus, local capacity, local relationships. This is one of the primary directions. Like there's this book that my computer is on. By the way, this book called The Fourth Turning, it's a bit heady, but it does describe the 4 seasons and it gives some information about the generations and all. But one of the things, and this book, by the way, was published in 1997. Sorry about my hair. It was published in 1997 and it was written, a couple of years prior. So, and they predicted, like they said, like in this book, it literally says like, expect around 2020 for there to be a constitutional crisis, a possible pandemic, like the things they list, it's like, and it's just because it's not because they're Nostradamus, they just know that they know the cycle, they know how this goes. So for organizations, you want to stay really nimble and like really help, because you're a foundational organization in your community, really help people, connect and feel connected to their local community. If there's ways that you can do that, that's a big one. And then also, in certain terms of your own organization, as much as possible, you want to get Xers and Millennials working together. Xers and Millennials, like everyone talks about reverse mentoring, like, oh, reverse mentoring. And it's this whole like, oh, the Millennials are going to teach, the boomers how to use Snapchat. It's like, okay, whatever, I don't know, maybe that's useful, maybe it's not. But the real energy, the fulcrum point for society in terms of where we're going and how we're going to come out of this is really in the hands of Xers in a big way, because they're the midlife leaders. But Xers have to, because they're frenetic and busy, they have to be able to pass off the work. They have to be able to say, this is what needs to be done. And they have to be able to give it to their teams to get stuff done. Well, that natural alignment by age is going to be mostly midlife Xer leaders and mostly millennial implementers, right? So the training and the alignment and just any work that you could do to get these 2 generations understanding each other better and working together better. It does not mean to the disrespect of the disinclusion of boomers, but the power to move things fast and to create an organization and a culture and all that can change and move on a dime is really in this dynamic of these two generations.
Thank you. That was great.
Play, right? Think of if you can think of 50 articles or whatever you've read that mention generations. It's like boomers, 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 millennials, millennials, millennials. And now they go Gen Z, Gen Z, Gen Z. And they just don't even mention Xers. It's like Xers are, by the way, here's a little funny little tidbit. Xers are actually the largest generation, which nobody believes, but they are. And the reason is because during Xers' young adulthood was the fall season. Well, in fall, society is in harvest mode. When you're in harvest mode, there's plenty of apples coming off the tree. There's plenty of grapes to make wine. There's plenty of grain coming out of the fields to put in the silos. We have plenty of room for immigrants. We got lots of jobs. So what happened was that Xers, while they were smaller in birth years, smaller in birth numbers, had profound numbers of them come over as children as immigrants and then as young adults as immigrants. So they're actually larger than millennials, just by a smidge, but you would never know it by the way society talks and the media talks about generations. And I'm just an advocate for it. It's like, first of all 4 generations have value. And second, like I said, we're in winter. Let's talk about winter. Let's just stop talking about these 10 characteristics of millennials or these whatever, and like really understand the cultural environment we're in and the need for each generation to be in its place. Like Gen Xers are the generals. They're your George Washingtons. They're your generals. You know, millennials are the good soldiers. It's like, work with that energy. I know you took your question and went all over the place with it, but hopefully that helps.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jessie. This was awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, this was really good.
Jack, if you want to tweet me or, whatever, I would love to hear it, just because I'd love to do this presentation more and, and get this word out. And I'm really, I want people to understand that it's like, there's power in this stuff. And it's like one of the examples that I give with people is I often say, like, does a fish understand water, right? Like, we're so enmeshed in culture that you can't be yourself outside of culture. So it's very hard to see culture. And it's very hard to see culture change because you're just living your life, right? And then suddenly there's a new store, there's suddenly a new category of restaurants called fast casual, there's a Chipotle, and then there's a Cava, and then there's, like these changes happen. But if you can stand above it and you can look at it, you can see like, oh, that's this influence happening, that's that influence happening. And like I said, we're in winter now, so it's time for all of us to be on our A game.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We'll be in touch with feedback, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Yeah, appreciate your time, everyone.
Thank you.